On the 3rd of August 1892, the Houses of Parliament witnessed a rather unusual scene. A wagonette pulled up, a small open-topped wagon, with a trumpeter in the back playing the French national anthem, the Marseillaise, which at that time still had some rather revolutionary overtones. And out of that wagon came a bearded man wearing a working man's tweed suit, a red scarf, and a deerstalker hat. He cut a rather strange figure within the well-heeled confines of Parliament, and his style of dress caused a minor outburst. MPs at that time didn't dress like that. Being all male and mostly upper class, they wore frock coats and top hats. So who was this person, arriving at Parliament and flying in the face of convention? It was Keir Hardie, newly elected MP for West Ham South. In his 36 years, he had been a miner, a journalist, and a trade union secretary, and now he stood at the forefront of the growing labour movement and at the heart of the corridors of power. And over the next half hour or so, what I'd like to do is to talk to you about the events that brought him to that point, what he was able to do there, and the lessons that we can learn from his life. Keir Hardie was born in 1856 in a tiny town called Legbrannock in Lanarkshire, Scotland. He was an illegitimate child. He never knew his biological father. And in 1859, his mother married a man named David Hardie, and shortly after that, the family moved to Glasgow. By the age of 10, Hardie was already at work as a delivery boy for a baker. And it was at this point that an incident occurs that I think would prove formative for him. In late 1866, Hardie's stepfather was away looking for work, making Hardie the family breadwinner. His brother was badly sick with a fever, and he had to help his pregnant mother nurse the child, meaning he was up most of the night before leaving for work the next day. This meant he was late several days in a row. He arrived tired, hungry, and wet from the rain, and was sent to see the owner, but was told to wait until he had finished his prayers. He was then ushered into a room where the owner of the bakery sat with his family at a table piled high with food, probably more food than he had seen in one place for quite some time at that point. The man fired Hardie, and in order to teach him to be more punctual, fined him a week's wages. Hardie remembered this incident bitterly in later life and wrote that it makes me doubt the sincerity of those who make pretense in their prayers. Within that incident, I think two key themes are apparent that will become important for Hardie in his later life. First, he was consistently concerned for the welfare of those who were poor and precariously employed, because he knew that from his own experience. He knew how difficult, how painful that could be. And second, Hardie frequently displayed disdain for hypocritical Christians who made a great show of their personal piety while mistreating their workers and failing to care for the poor. By the time he was 12, Hardie was working in the mines as a trapper, opening and closing a trap door in order to regulate the flow of air in and out of a mine shaft. The work was hard and often extremely dangerous, and Hardie stated outright that under no circumstances, given freedom of choice, would I live that part of my life over again. By the 1870s, Hardie was a full-fledged miner, a hewer and coal cutter, and was beginning to get involved with the growing trade union movement. To give a little bit of background, at this point, Hardie supported the Liberal Party, as most trade unionists did. At this time, there were some working-class MPs, but they were members of the Liberal Party, and thus found it difficult to be truly militant in favour of workers' rights, as the mine owners who paid their salaries were also Liberals. In 1878, a major transition occurred for Hardie when he became a Christian. Now, we don't actually know much about this. Hardie himself writes in a scrap of diary, brought up an atheist, converted to Christianity in 1878. And that's the only record we have from him about that experience. There were probably several factors that led to his conversion to Christian faith, key among them being his involvement in the temperance movement, the campaign against the alcohol trade, through which he would likely have met several Christians, and through which he also met his wife, Lily. As his prominence in trade union activities grew, Hardie was sacked and blacklisted from work in the mines. After a failed strike led to a public dispute with another union leader, Hardy moved to Cumnock in Ayrshire, where he obtained a job as a journalist. He did that for 4 years, and then got another job as a union secretary. Another failed strike in 1886 led to riots and indiscriminate arrests of striking workers. This brought Hardy to a very significant realisation for him, and that was that, as I've mentioned before, the mine owners were liberals, and so were the government. Thus, if pressed, the government was never going to act to protect striking workers. They were going to act for the mine owners against the miners, even to the point of violence. Hardy realised, therefore, that the working class needed independent political representation. And some writers have said that this realisation comes home to him with such force that it's almost like a second conversion, a political one this time. In 1888, Hardy fought his first by-election in the constituency of Mid Lanark. He came last, bottom of the poll in fact, but the election is notable in that he was able to persuade a number of working class voters to make a break from the Liberal Party and support him. In the aftermath of this, he held a conference in Glasgow, where he started a new political party, the Scottish Labour Party. In 1892, Hardy was asked to stand as a socialist candidate in West Ham South. This time he won, after the Liberal candidate unexpectedly died, leaving their local party in disarray, and many of their supporters fell in behind him. In the House of Commons, he quickly made a name for himself as someone who was prepared to stand up for the rights of the unemployed, so much so that he earned the moniker of the member for the unemployed. He went so far as to say that the government that does not legislate for the unemployed does not deserve the confidence of this House. An incendiary statement, made all the more so when you realise that he made it in his maiden speech. Hardy campaigned for higher income tax for those earning more than £1,000 a year, £1,000 of course being a very large amount of money in those days, and for the money raised to be put towards old age pensions and education for the working class. Hardy also made a name for himself as someone who was unafraid to criticise the monarchy. At one point, he made a motion to add a message of condolence to the families of those killed in a mining explosion in Wales, to an address congratulating the Duchess of York on the birth of her son. The motion was denied, and Hardy proceeded to make a speech criticising Parliament's servile attitude towards the monarchy. A contemporary reporter describes the scene in this way: "The House rose at him like a pack of wild dogs. His voice was drowned in a din of insults and the drumming of feet on the floor. But he stood there, white-faced, blazing-eyed, his lips moving, though the words were swept away." And I think this displays quite clearly Hardy's willingness to stand alone in a cause that he felt was right. In this instance, virtually no one stood with him, and yet he held his ground. In 1893, Hardy presided over a conference in Bradford, which witnessed the foundation of the Independent Labour Party. The Independent Labour Party is not the Labour Party as we know it today, but it's an important precursor organisation. And Hardy also founded a new newspaper called the Labour Leader in order to advance the cause of working people. Kenneth Morgan, one of Hardy's biographers, says that this conference demonstrated the political genius of Keir Hardie. And I really do think this is where you get to see him as a political operator. A lot of socialist organisations at that time were quite doctrinaire and rigid. You were either entirely with them or you were out. Hardie, on the other hand, was able to draw together a broad coalition of people representing a spectrum of working class interests that was able to be distinct from the Liberal Party, whilst also not as rigidly socialist as some other organisations in existence at that time. In 1895, Hardie lost his seat in West Ham, following which he travelled around giving speeches, supporting strikes, and also wrote and spoke prolifically in opposition to the Boer War, which was going on at that time. In 1899, Hardie became involved in a rather bitter public argument with a man named John Campbell White, better known as Lord Overton. Overton was a prominent industrialist. He owned a chrome factory. He was a benefactor to evangelists and a supporter of keeping the Sabbath free from work. In fact, conditions in his chrome factory were awful, extremely dangerous. Men were working 12 hours a day, inhaling toxic dust and vapour, and had their wages docked if they refused to work on Sunday. Hardy wrote an excoriating series of articles in the Labour Leader in which he exposed these conditions completely. These articles were later collected in a pamphlet provocatively entitled "White Slaves." Attacking such a pillar of the community did not go unnoticed. Hardy faced attack in the press and also from the pulpit. He was attacked by a number of clergy, accused of being an atheist and of trying to stir up a scandal. And interestingly, this results in some of the clearest statements we have of Hardy's own personal faith, made all the more interesting by the fact that he doesn't seem to have been attending any church at this point. Hardy stated openly that "I believe in Christ's gospel of love and brotherhood and service." He went on, "I have great faith in the power of Christ's gospel, which our churches so shamefully pervert, as a regenerating force over the hearts and lives of men. And because of this, I want it to have a fair chance of doing its work, and that it cannot have, so long as it is burdened by such weights as Lord Overton." Hardy's campaign was successful. His claims prompted the medical inspector of factories to visit Overton's chrome works, and in the face of mounting scandal, Overton agreed to increase wages, improve conditions, and largely abolished Sunday working. I think it's worth taking a pause from the narrative of Hardy's faith at this point to consider, narrative of Hardy's life rather, to consider his faith. Just what kind of a faith was it that he was defending against these attacks? Just what kind of a Christian was he at this point in his life? Paul Bickley has called Hardy's faith a primitive biblical radicalism. Hardy seems to have taken the Bible seriously and fairly literally. He never seems to have doubted either the historicity of Jesus or that his teachings have political relevance. In his speeches and writings, Hardy appeals frequently to biblical and Christian language. In the major work that he wrote in his lifetime, which is called From Serfdom to Socialism, Hardy devotes an entire chapter to the relationship of socialism and Christianity, within which he draws on the Bible, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, and also the writings and practices of several movements in church history. He claims that, quote, "Communism, the final goal of socialism, is a form of social economy very closely akin to the principles set forth in the Sermon on the Mount." He goes on, "In its lofty contempt for thrift and forethought, it goes far in advance of anything ever put forward by any communist, ancient or modern." It should be noted, of course, that as he was writing before the Russian Revolution, Hardy doesn't have the same kind of negative associations associated with the term communism that many of us would have today. Hardy, despite this clearly stated faith in Christ, often had an uneasy relationship with the institutional church. Having been very committed to church attendance in his 20s and 30s, indeed having been a lay preacher, he doesn't seem to have attended church at all after entering the House of Commons. He frequently found himself being labelled an atheist by the evangelical clergy of his day, many of whom were opposed to his political beliefs. Hardy, for his part, levelled sometimes caustic criticism at the church, which he saw as uncaring in the face of the suffering of the poor. He went so far as to write in 1897, quote, "A holocaust of every church building in Christendom tonight would be an act of sweet savour in the sight of him whose name is supposed to be worshipped within their walls. If the spiritually proud and pride-blinded professors of Christianity could only be made to feel and see that Christ is here, ever present with us, and that they are urging on the stripes and binding the brow afresh with thorns and making shed tears of blood in a million homes, surely the world could be made more sweet by the establishment of his kingdom." In a passage like that, you can almost feel his anger at the church, but also see his desire for God's kingdom to come. Despite the oppositional nature of his dealings with the church, it seems clear to me, at least, that Hardy's Christian faith was, at least in some sense, a driver of his political outlook. Another of Hardy's biographers, Bob Holman, summarises it in this way: "He met a Christ who sympathised with the poor rather than the rich, and who urged his followers not to lord it over others, but to act as their servants. They were brothers." Now, around the same time as he was involved in his dispute with Lord Overton, Hardy was able to build links between the ILP and the Trade Union Congress. This resulted in the creation of a committee called the Labour Representation Committee, the LRC, the aim of which was to try and create an independent working class group in Parliament. At the general election in 1900, Hardy was re-elected to Parliament, this time representing the constituency of Merthyr Tydfil in Wales. Despite the intentions of the TUC, Hardy found himself alone in Parliament again, as there was still no working class group of MPs. Throughout the early 1900s, the LRC won a few by-elections, and then saw a breakthrough at the general election in 1906, when 50 candidates stood on an LRC platform and 29 of them were elected. The new MPs met on the first day of Parliament and agreed to call themselves the Labour Party. In the leadership elections for the newly formed party, Hardy was elected leader, though by quite a narrow margin. His leadership of the Parliamentary Labour Party is not generally seen as a success, mostly due to weaknesses in his people management skills, and also the fact that he was never entirely comfortable with what he saw as the rather stuffy conventions in the House of Commons. Hardy continued to fight for the causes of those excluded from power. In particular, he became a passionate campaigner for women's suffrage, both in and outside of Parliament. In 1907, Hardy became seriously ill, and in order to recuperate, he decided to spend time travelling around the world. He visited the USA and spoke out against colonialism in India and South Africa, returning to the UK in 1908. At the election in 1910, Hardy retained his seat and substantially increased his share of the vote. 1914 saw the outbreak of the First World War. Hardy was vigorously opposed to the conflict, believing it to be inherently contrary both to Christianity and to socialism. And for this he met with vicious criticism. It got so bad that he was heard to say that, "I understand what Christ suffered in Gethsemane as well as any man living." In January 1915, Hardy suffered a stroke, and though he was clearly ill, initially refused to rest, although he later went to a hydro to recuperate before returning to Scotland. His health continued to worsen, and he ultimately died of pneumonia in September 1915 at the age of 59. So what can we say about Keir Hardie? From a modern perspective, Hardie appears a very complex man, sometimes a contradictory man. There is much that you can admire in him, and also not a little that is hard to admire. The historian Fred Reid writes that every Labour tendency can construct its own Keir Hardie: the broad church, socialist momentum, Christian socialism, political pragmatism. Hardie is not one of us. He belongs to history and to no political movement of the present time. I think Reid has a point. A number of groups, both Christian and non-Christian, both socialist and non-socialist, appear able to hold Hardie up as representing what they believe. And in assessing the legacy of anyone from the past, it is important to recognise that they belong primarily to their time, not ours. While Hardie consistently fought causes we would see as just today, from the rights of the unemployed to votes for women to anti-colonialism, his ideas for addressing these issues are often very much of his time and sometimes can sound quite odd to modern ears. And I think the answer to this is that he can't be claimed by any one political movement, and yet his powerful moral voice can still speak to us today, and there are distinct lessons that we can draw from the unique narrative of his life. Now, Hardie's probably not the only one that can teach us these lessons, but these are key themes that emerge from the story of his life. Hardie, in many ways, is a classic example of a certain kind of social reformer, those who are unappreciated in their own time and yet see the greatest popularity and results for their ideas after their own deaths. In his own lifetime, Hardie did not succeed in doing much more than raising the consciousness of working people. He never held a government office. He never saw the Labour Party form government at all. But within 10 years of his death, in 1924, the Labour Party achieved its first short period in government. And 20 years after that, in 1945, it won a majority for the first time. And of course, many of us will know that Clement Attlee's Labour government was able to realise policies that Hardie could only have dreamt of during his own time. Not least the establishment of a welfare state and a universal healthcare system, perhaps the crowning achievement of a political movement that would not have been possible without Keir Hardie. And I think there's a lesson here about the nature of success in social reform. While some reformers have achieved real success in changing laws or structures during their own time, sometimes success lies more in creating or promoting a movement that will last beyond you. An additional lesson for the social reformers of today might lie in Hardy's willingness to stand alone, to endure sometimes vicious opposition to his beliefs. In response to his opposition to the First World War, for example, as I've mentioned already, Hardy endured such vicious opposition that some writers have suggested it may have hastened his death. And generally speaking, I think culture today doesn't always embrace difficulty or struggle as a vehicle for growth. It prefers to reject them as obstacles or impositions on our freedom or our success or our happiness. But I think the life of Hardy and the lives of other social reformers that have faced opposition for their beliefs makes quite a sharp statement. If we truly seek to reform the conditions of society, then struggle will come, whether we like it or not. This struggle might be intense, and it might result in damage to reputation or even physical harm. But the life of Hardy, the lives of others like him, can show us that such struggle is, in Hardy's words, the price of the ticket if we desire real change. And lastly, I think Hardy's life can speak to us of the importance of popular pressure and agitation in social reform. Right to the very end of his life, Hardy regarded himself as an agitator more than a politician. He wrote that my work has been to stir up a divine discontent with wrong. While he never advocated for revolutionary violence, Hardy consistently felt more comfortable on a platform as a mass demonstration than in the chamber of the House of Commons. And indeed, one thing he really can be credited with is helping to make the labour movement truly a mass movement. And Hardy would almost certainly be found supporting mass movements for change in our own time, although he might have some catching up to do in regards to the issues involved. And his life really is a testament to the power of popular consciousness-raising movements to make real change, sometimes regardless of the actions of individual politicians. So Keir Hardie had a relatively short life, dying before he reached the age of 60, but I think it was a remarkable one. To quote Kenneth Morgan again, he rose from the pits of Ayrshire to change the world. With virtually no formal education, he helped create a movement that went on to change this country, a movement powerfully driven by his faith in Jesus. And I think his example of Christian engagement with politics and a tireless fight for the rights of working people can still inspire us today.